There's a theory called Grabby aliens, which is a good name for a theory, but it's a bad theory. And today we're going to talk about what the theory is, why it's bad, and also why it shows bad data visualization. Let's dive in. Yo, what's up everybody? So if you're new here, welcome. My name is Reese. I was a tech ethics teacher at MIT for a bit, but mostly I'm an information sponge who's trying to understand how the world works. And so over the past decade, I've read hundreds of books and I've put them all into my little brain, my little second brain, where I have these 20,000 note cards that I study, kind of like Duolingo, but instead of becoming fluent in a language, I become fluent in reality. And so I kind of want to share with you some of the things I've learned from my studies. And today we're doing that with this series, on how everything evolved, where we look at the Big Bang through AI and try to understand stuff. And right now we're talking about space, and we're talking about aliens in space. And specifically, we are here to talk about the Grabby aliens theory. And so I'm going to talk about what the theory is, why it's wrong, and why the data visualization with it is also wrong. And so the theory behind Grabby aliens is, it starts with this idea that we're early in the universe, and that the Earth is early in terms of all civilizations. So you can see here's 14 billion years ago, here's today, and then you say, wow, here's all this time in the future. Look at all that. This is hundreds of trillions, tens of trillions of years in the future. And you say, wow, if you look at this, and you say, well, we are here. Oh my God. We're at the very, very beginning of all the civilizations that might exist. Because in the future, there are going to be all these little planets called red dwarfs, which are these little planets that last a really long time. Versus our sun, which only lasts 10 billion years, these red dwarfs last 10 trillion years. And so the theory here is that we're early. Ooh, isn't that surprising? And in order to make it less surprising, you say, well, maybe we're wrong about all these red dwarfs that are going to happen in the future. Maybe instead, there are these Grabby aliens that exist that, are here before us-ish or around our time. And what they do is they actually end up colonizing all these other red dwarf planets. And so what it makes us look like is says, oh, we're not actually early, we're normal. Why are we normal? Well, because all the other planets that we're going to get, that was going to have life on them later, they're actually going to be colonized later. And so it's not surprising. And so what this does is it tells us, oh, we're actually just normal. We are one of the civilizations that comes around this time, is around all these Grabby aliens, and those ones will eventually colonize the rest of the red dwarfs. So it makes us look normal instead of early. That's kind of good. And the issue with this, in my opinion, is, and so they have, Robin, the creator of this, who's been on my podcast, by the way. Hello, Robin. I think Robin's good. I think Robin's smart. He's also an economist, so you can kind of, not an astrobiologist, so you can see a little bit of his, but he's polymathic. And so I think you can see here is this little graph that he has made to show this, where you say, okay. And so what Robin's saying is that if the max planet lifetime is, 1,000 gig years, aka a trillion years, 1 to 10 trillion years, which is true for all the red dwarfs. And the other thing he adds here is, this is the number of hard steps. And so the idea is that there's all these hard steps to get where we are now. You had to start life, and then you had to endosymbiosis, and then you had to get photosynthesis, and then you had to get multicellularity, and then you had to get sapiens. And so there's a lot of these hard steps, maybe 6 or whatever, for Earth. And so those only can happen, those happen stochastically and slowly over time. And so if you have 6 hard steps, then you say, oh my God, we are so early. We're, this is the percentage, these numbers are what percent of all civilizations that exist, where are we in that curve? And so this would be like, wow, we are in the 0.00001 percentile. We're like the earliest civilization out there. There's going to be all these civilizations in the future, and we are one of the earliest ones. And so this graph kind of shows, oh wow, it's pretty unlikely that, we know that the max planet lifetime, it's not, for our planet's around for roughly 5 billion years. The number of hard steps is, 6-ish if you want to call it that. Oh man, there's no way we're in the bottom left corner of this graph. That's just so unlikely. And so that's why then you say, well, the only likely thing then is Grabby aliens, because they colonize all the planets, which makes us look not early, which takes all of these numbers and turns them to be, instead of 0.1% or whatever, it makes them be like, oh, we're just in the 20th percentile of earliness for planets. So that's the idea behind Grabby aliens. Well, I think it's wrong. The easiest way to understand why it's wrong, and David Kipping of Cool Worlds has a great video on this, which is that if you look at the red dwarfs here, and you're like, wow, there's going to be so many red dwarfs in the future. So you have all these red dwarfs that are going to last 1 trillion years. That's where all the life is going to form. Well, actually, the issue is that red dwarfs are not easy to have life on, are bad for life. So David Kipping has a good thing on this where he looks at the same thing and says, wow, isn't it weird though that we ourselves are not on a red dwarf? Like, why are we not on a red dwarf? There's so many of these red dwarfs out there, and we aren't on one because they're bad for life. They get tidally locked. They have bad UV, solar wind and UV rays that are removing atmospheres and killing stuff. And so there's a whole bunch of reasons why they're bad for life. And also, Avi Loeb has a great, who's been on my podcast in the past, he has a great piece on this too. You know, he says, oh, Robin's paper cites my paper 7 times, but I totally disagree with Robin's paper. And it's because he says similar things. Red dwarfs are bad for life. And so what it makes it look like is we are not actually early. And in fact, we might be late, because when you look at the graph of, stellar SFR, which is stellar formation rate, then you see that there's this cosmic noon, 10 billion years ago. And in fact, when you look at most star-producing things, and you say, oh, what about planets and stars that can actually life, that are habitable for life? Then you say, well, we actually might be late. Maybe the actual chunk of really good star-making and planet-making time was a few billion years ago. And so maybe we're actually in like the 66th percentile for all, we're not in the 0.0001th percentile. We're not like the earliest planet ever. It's like, no, we're actually kind of in the middle/late. And so that, I think, a better explanation for what we see out there in the universe. And the other part about this is the hard steps, which is this question where you say, oh, how many hard steps are there? And you could argue that there are, if you think about our planet and you think about here's 4.5 billion years ago, and here's now. And you could say there's something like 6 hard steps, but when you actually look at how quickly life formed, it formed super quickly after Earth started. And then a bunch of things like multicellularity was actually convergently evolved 30 plus times. This is kind of an easy move in design space. The thing that's the hardest, and this is a Nick Laneism, is endosymbiosis. Endosymbiosis is really hard. This is 2.5 billion years ago. This is one where, where an archaea was eaten by a bacteria, or vice versa, I forget. And that is when we got the mitochondria, and that allowed us to have these bigger cells, that allowed us to have multicellularity. And this, we've only seen it happen 3 times in life. The first endosymbiotic event, the Linn-Margulis one, we've seen it with cyanobacteria, where cyanobacteria was put inside a existing cell, and that created all of plants and things like that, and allowed the chloroplast to exist as a little subunit, as an organelle within these cells. And then the third one, this is a very recent one, where we just saw it in the wild. We saw this, it was maybe a nitroplast, maybe, I think, where a nitrogen fixing bacteria was put inside another one. But essentially, we've very rarely seen endosymbiotic events. And so that shows that these are pretty rare. And then something like the other thing that's probably rare is, it's tough to sell, but something like getting sapiens is actually probably pretty rare, because it has to be warm enough. You have to get brain-sized things. You have to stand up. You have to have the hands. You have to get a bigger brain. The bigger brain, then that needs to get ready for language. And then once you have language, and there's a question of which of these is the actually hardest step. After you have language, then you start to domesticate things and then find fossil fuels. But I think something in the range of sapiens is probably a hard step. So I think there's not 6 hard steps, but I think there's more like 2 hard steps. And so that makes this whole graph look more clear, where you say, oh, actually, most planet lifetimes were mostly star-like, actually. It's not a bunch of red dwarf intelligent civilizations existing. Those might get life, but not intelligent life. So we're more like a planet lifetime of 5 billion years, kind of like ours, pretty star-like, and that the amount of hard steps is more like 2. And then when you do that, you get right here in the bottom left corner. We're like, oh, we're early-ish, we're normal-ish, we're late-ish, we're 50th percentile, And so that, I think, is why I disagree with the Grabby aliens theory. Okay, so now we can talk about the third thing, which is why I'm annoyed with the data visualization of Grabby aliens. And I think this is a crucial idea when you think about any kind of scientific theory, which is how it's presented. And I think, so there's 2 things to say here. The first is, now we're talking about bad data viz. And not only bad data viz, but almost on purpose I don't know, it's frame, what I would call frame control, where you state the frame of the debate and then it's impossible to like push back against it. So my issue here is that when you look at these hard steps, one of the things that feels so unlikely about this is because all of the probability mass of this chart makes it look like it's in the top corner. And you say, oh no, what if we actually are down here? And you're like, well, that would be crazy. That's so unlikely. What do you mean we're in the bottom left corner? So I think this graph is essentially on purpose, because it goes all the way to 20 freaking hard steps, and because it goes to a max planet lifetime of 10 trillion years, it makes it look like the bottom left corner is super unreasonable to even claim. But in fact, it's, as I showed before, it's actually very reasonable to claim the bottom left corner. And so I think from a data viz perspective, you can imagine, this is me just having cropped it a bit, even this one makes it look more reasonable, where you say, okay, yeah, you could be over here, or you could be up here, I don't know. And it all kind of makes it feel easier to make a claim that we only have a few hard steps with a short max planet lifetime. So that's my kind of annoyance with the data viz of the graph. And it's also similar to part of the theory, which is the aliens part of the theory is tempting, mimetically tempting to claim something like Grabby aliens. You're like, oh, well, if there's some kind of explanation out there, you're like, oh, it's these Grabby aliens that are moving at the speed of light towards us, and that's why we haven't seen them, and we'll only ever see them. It's not falsifiable because we're only going to ever see them right before they hit us. And that's kind of tempting. It's interesting, Grabby aliens, it spreads on the internet easily, whatever, versus a simpler claim, which is, but a more astrobiologically grounded claim, which is, it's actually red dwarfs. Red dwarfs are tidally locked, and it's hard for them to support intelligent, complex life. That claim doesn't spread as easily, and so we should just be wary of both bad data viz, but also when you hear a claim that's mimetically juicy, like Grabby aliens, versus a less mimetically juicy claim like normal red dwarfs, be wary of the mimetic claim. Cool. So that is why I'm against Grabby aliens. Robin, thank you for the work that you've done here in presenting this theory. And thank you all for listening. If you're curious to see more about how everything evolved, we're about to get into the start of life, which is very exciting. And so definitely subscribe for more on that. And as always, thank you to the supporters of Root for supporting the educational content of the channel. Bye.